Today on the show, I'm going to share why you actually need more courage, not more information. Why it is really easy to find a New Testament church today. Some people say, I want to find a church that's like the early church. Can I just explain to you why that's actually like really, really easy thing to do, not hard to find? Why there's no such thing as a private decision that only affects you personally. And then I'll end with a book review, actually this time from two books by the biblical scholar Peter Leithart, one about the Old Testament and one about the four Gospels, and they kind of go together. So I'll share some insights from those books as well. So today, we will start with our intentionality corner. Let me share with you why you don't need more information. You really just need more courage. So let me kind of just share kind of the main idea and then a couple thoughts. Here's the deal. Most of the time, we need more courage, not more information. For example, many of us know what we need to do to eat better, or we know what we need to do to get better grades. We know what we need to do to attract more clients at our job. Now, the reality is, of course, we don't know everything. Nobody does. But most of us know what we should do if we want to make progress on a goal. You might not need to know everything, but you probably know like at least some of the next steps you're supposed to take. Often what holds us back from taking those steps is courage. It's not information. It's courage. That's often our bottleneck. See, one of the biggest reasons I have found personally why we don't try, one of the reasons why we kind of maybe lack courage is because of our fear of what people might think. So for example, we think, will they think I'm a failure if it doesn't work? Will they think I don't know what I'm doing? Will they roll their eyes thinking I have no shot at making this thing come into a reality? And so I just want to say, here's one of the best pieces of advice that I have ever heard when it comes to maybe trying something, doing something, especially if fear of what other people might think is going to hold you back. One of the best pieces of advice I've heard when facing your fears about what people think is this. Instead of thinking about the proverbial they, what will they think, you should think of individual people. You see, the reality is that people have a lot going on in their lives, just like you do. Most of us hardly spend any time thinking about other people. And so instead of worrying about what they would think, consider what Sam or John or Lauren specifically will think. Not the proverbial they, but think of specific people. Because here's what I found. When you bring it down to the level of individual people, all of a sudden, they don't feel so scary. You see, at the end of the day, does it really matter if John doesn't think you can do it? Does it really matter if Lauren decides to unfollow you on Instagram because you decided to maybe niche down on some content that you share and she isn't interested in that content? Of course, hear me, this is not to say we should never care what other people think. We should get advice. We should get feedback. But it should be from those who are closest to us and from those whom we trust and respect. And most often, can I just say this, those people are going to support you because they want to see you succeed. And so to gain more courage, don't think about them. Go with the knowledge you already have and take your next step. So that's the deal. Listen, the intentional life, let me give you like a really specific example of trying things, changing things, knowing that like most people don't care. So you're listening right now. This is the 5th episode of The Intentional Life with Dylan Dodson. Those of you that have maybe followed me for a while, maybe you subscribe to the Best Minute newsletter, follow me on socials, whatever, you might have noticed that this is a show that has changed. It originally was called The Dylan Dodson Show, and that even changed like twice. So when I started the Dylan Dodson Show, maybe it was the summer of 24, I did it for 6 months, and it was just interviewing interesting people from all different jobs, careers, that sort of thing. And I had 2 challenges with it. One, it was really hard to find people, because I'm reaching out to people, and it's just like it's hard to find doing a weekly show when this is obviously, in case you haven't heard, not Joe Rogan or something like that, where people are like beating down the door to come on my show. So I had to find people. That was hard. And then sometimes like I don't really know these people, and they don't give a good interview, and so that was hard. So I did that for 6 months, weekly show every single week. I think like 30 episodes, something like that. And then I was like, you know what? Let me shift it a little bit more to like just people of faith. It could be pastors, business leaders, whoever, that are actually Christians, because I know a lot of those. My personal network, I know a lot of pastors. Just talking about wisdom for daily life, so issues that are important to them. And by the way, I enjoyed those conversations more, but it's still, the problem was like, hey, doing this weekly, like that's 52 people a year, struggling to find people to like come on the show. And so I was like, well, I'm going to change it again. I was trying to think about, do I even want to continue to do this? And then, long story short, the idea of the intentional life came on, which, by the way, fits way more nicely with my Best Minute newsletter, which I've been going on doing that for about 4 years now. And so yeah, so it's changed. Now, here's the deal. Maybe generally speaking, I'm like people who maybe were listening to this show be like, "What is this guy doing?" But on the individual level, like I'm not really that concerned. Like if somebody doesn't want to listen to the show, like who cares? That sort of thing. So that's like a personal example. Like, yeah, that's weird that I would keep changing, but most people either stop listening to the show or they say, "Oh, he changed the episodes," or now he's called The Intentional Life, and now I listen to this, and you probably thought about it for like 2 minutes and then haven't thought about it since. Like at all. And so I just want to say, like, again, if you're thinking about like what is everyone going to think if I change this thing, yeah, that seems scary. But like there's no individual person that I was like, well, I don't care if they don't like it or don't like it. Like what I'm doing here is not morally wrong or evil. So it's like it's just preference. And it's like, so who cares? So I just want to encourage you, like when you bring it down to the individual level, it makes it a lot easier to make changes or maybe to try something new. Because can I just say, when you do try something new, you are going to look a little foolish. You don't really know the best strategies or all the things to do. And so, yeah, it's going to look not great. And so, but if you, on the individual level, if you're like, but who really cares? Like, do I really care if this person doesn't like it or stops following me or whatever? Probably not. So bring they to the individual level. Now, again, caveat, which I already mentioned, this is not do whatever you want no matter what anyone thinks. Now, I'm not saying do whatever you want no matter what anyone thinks. You should have people in your life that you trust, and you should receive feedback from them. But this is not everybody. This is not a free-for-all. People that you love, you trust. And so if you're trying to decide, hey, should I try this thing or is this a good thing? I would say like, hey, ask the people that you know and trust. And if it's a morally wrong thing, then you should like give wisdom. Or if you're like going to completely like maybe quit your job and try this other full-time YouTube channel thing, let's say you want to do that. It's like, yeah, someone's like, hey, maybe we take baby steps. That's wise. So have a couple of people if there's a decision, but again, not the proverbial they. And I just want to remind yourself this. Remember that no one is thinking about anyone, just like you're not consistently thinking about everyone else. Like no one is thinking about you. And here's the thing, like when you do think about someone else, after about like 30 seconds to maybe 2 minutes, you're already on to the next thing. So maybe someone does think like, I can't believe like Susie is trying to do that. She hasn't been successful in that before. Like, okay, they'll think about it. They'll maybe like be critical of you for like 2 minutes and then they're on to the next thing. They don't even care. So I just like, again, want to remind you, like, even if they do think about you, it's going to be like for 30 seconds to 2 minutes tops, and then they don't even care anymore either. So here's what, again, when it comes to making changes or trying to do the thing, start with what you know, change and adapt as you learn more, and then go for it. Because here's the deal. Listen, no one really cares what you are doing anyway, unless you're providing value to them, which you can only get there by starting small. So again, you don't need more information. You just need more courage. Now switching to our faith reflection, I always want to spend a few minutes talking about this idea of where can I find a New Testament church? So we are in the book of Acts as I'm recording this at New City Church, getting close to finishing it up. And in Acts chapter 2, I'm just going to read these 5 verses. It's like one of the most famous passages, especially when people talk about the church. And one of the things you hear, at least in church world, if you follow Jesus, is this idea of like, man, I want to find a church that's like the New Testament church, or I want to find like an early church, like the first century. And the churches today, they're corrupted, or they're all about money, or they're about buildings, and it's just so hard to find. I want to read to you the passage where people always say, I want a church like that. And then I just want to like show you that these kind of churches are actually everywhere. All right, so Acts 2, chapter 42 to 47, I'm just going to read these 5 verses, okay? This is the early church after Pentecost. The Spirit has fallen, and Jesus has resurrected from the dead. He's ascended back into heaven, and cool things are happening. I'm just going to read these 5 verses straight through. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. This is like what everyone says when they want to find like a New Testament church or an early church. They're talking about this passage. Verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and signs were being performed through the apostles. Now all the believers were together and held all things in common. They sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all, as any had need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all people. Every day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. And you read a passage like that and you're like, that's what I want. And so again, everybody wants to be a part of a community like that. They're giving, they're serving, they care for one another, they're praying, and like they're friends, everyone cares for each other. It's awesome. And so you read that, you're like, I want a church like that. I want a New Testament church. As a pastor, I hear it all the time. I've heard it over the time. And can I just want to say, I do think that's a good desire. So I'm not knocking like the desire to want to live that out. But here's also what I have personally noticed over the years as a pastor, that many people, here's what they mean when they say they want a New Testament church, that many people simply want to show up to a pre-existing community that already operates like that without doing the work to create it. They already want it to be there so that when they feel like participating, they can jump in. And I just want to say, here's what they really want. They want a program to be in place. They want a commodity so that they can participate it when it works for them. So when they're not out of town, when they're not sick, when they aren't tired, they do feel like showing up to church. Like they want it to be there and just plug in, and so that's easy for them. Can I just say, the only way to experience a community like Acts chapter 2 is to be an active participant. It is not something that you can commoditize. It is something that you have to actively participate and do the hard work of committing to experience it. In other words, you can't just come and go. You can't just pick and choose when to participate. And so the question is, well, what does it take? Again, what does it take to be a part of a New Testament church? Again, I just want to read this quickly, verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. If you're really interested, you can go to newcityrd.com. Check out our sermons and go to my Acts 2 sermon. I'm just going to highlight two things real quick. I'm not going to get into all of it. The early church is summarized as devoting themselves to four key areas, which is the apostolic teaching, so teaching of Jesus, his commandments, and obedience to him. So they submitted to the teaching of the word. To fellowship, breaking bread, and to prayer. So teaching, not going to get into that here, might seem kind of obvious. Second thing they committed themselves to was fellowship. In other words, they met together consistently. In fact, in Acts chapter 2, it is specifically referring to right after Pentecost where the Spirit has come down. And so they were gathering together daily. Now, I'm not saying this is the pattern that you see happen continually in the New Testament. Like every day you got to get together with like your brothers and sisters of Christ. Obviously, it's not practical or feasible to maybe do it every day and to meet every day nonstop. But however, in the New Testament, we see that they gathered weekly on the Lord's Day, which is what we practice now Sunday, and they were in continuous fellowship with one another. So they were hanging out with each other even outside of that as well. And I just want to say, to experience a New Testament church is not something that you can experience by only going to a church service once or twice a month, and that's kind of it. You cannot experience a New Testament church if you only go to church once or twice a month, and that's pretty much it. Now, yes, our culture today is very different than the first century. So there's a lot of differences. So obviously there's going to be some differences there. We are, for example, way more individualistic, and we can travel around in ways they never could imagine. Like there was no, hey, where are you going this weekend in the ancient world? Like you're here. Like you're not going anywhere else. So I get that. But if you want to experience deep community, it requires considering how many Sundays you're going to miss a year. Because again, the first century church, they weren't going to church only half the year. Also, those of you who maybe love your local church a lot, so people at New City who love New City, maybe you are a committed part of your local church, or maybe you moved to a new area, and this is what I see a lot, it's kind of hard because the previous church you were part of at a different season of life, you really, really enjoyed. So maybe in a previous season of life, maybe you think back, man, I really love that community. I haven't been able to find something like that since I've moved. I would just submit to you, it's probably also because you were very consistent. So if you're, people that love New City where I lead, or maybe you're a part of a church that you love, or maybe a church, in a past season of life, you're probably really consistent. That was part of the reason it became so important to you. So the fellowship was intentional. The breaking of bread. Now the grammar in the Greek here, this could be talking about sharing meals together, but it's probably more specifically talking about the Lord's Supper, so communion together as part of their meals. That's probably what's going on here. So they take communion together, they worship together, in other words, and then prayer. And I just want to point this out too. They gathered together to pray for 10 days in Jerusalem before the Holy Spirit fell. And then when you continue to read Acts in the New Testament, prayer was an important part of their life. And by the way, not just individual prayer at home, before you go to bed, but corporate and consistent prayer, praying together, praying for one another. This was not I just pray every night before bed type of prayer, which those aren't bad, but that is very incomplete. This is more than that. And so in fact, when you read ancient documents, like the first couple of centuries of the early church, two things early Jesus followers did a lot of that we don't do as much of today is prayer together corporately and for one another, and fasting. They prayed and they also fasted. And this is why, just want to say this, why I get a little cynical when I hear people say, I just want to be like a church that we read about in Acts 2. here's why I get cynical, because this is what they did in the book of Acts to create that church. And most people, I should say most, many people, many Christians are unwilling to do those things. They don't have the same disciplined practices as the early church. And then they wonder why they can't find it. It's like, man, you got to do this to make it happen. It's why I can get kind of cynical. And so I would just say, how has prayer and fasting gone for you this year? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate it? And this is not a guilt, shame thing, that sort of thing. But if you'd give yourself like a 3, man, it's not like, don't complain. If you're having a hard time, if you're not being willing to be the type of person that you want other people to be. Like, you got to be the type of community that you want as well, because again, community is not a commodity. It is something that you pursue in your life as well. And so the only litmus test, by the way, can I just say this? If you're good at prayer, is if you do it. There's no such thing as someone who's bad at praying. It's just like, do you do it or do you not? Okay, so that's what's going on there. And then verse 44, I'm going to skip over here. I just want to say this. Then it says this, now all the believers were held together, had all things in common. 45, they sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. And so the fifth marker that you see in the New Testament church, early church, was this marker of generosity. Now, note, this is not forced, this is not coerced, this is not government mandated. They simply cared for one another as they saw each other that had needs. And so you see that in some of the New Testament letters as well, Paul talks about taking up an offering for Christians suffering in various places as well. So generosity is a big part. He never tells them, by the way, in the New Testament how much to give, but to give joyfully, consistently, and intentionally. And so again, if you want to be a part of, like a New Testament church, here's the question. If you want to be like the early church, the question you must ask yourself is this: what percentage of your income do you consistently give away? Consistently. Not every once in a while, not when you're in your feels, not when you got a bonus, not when something cool happens and you feel like you got to pay back to God. What percentage of your income do you consistently give away? Again, it's just why I honestly get really skeptical when I hear people talk about wanting a community like the early church, because in order to have that community, it requires you on the individual level to submit yourself to God's word, even the parts you don't like, praying intentionally, gathering consistently, fasting, and being more generous than the average American, which, by the way, gives maybe 1 to up to 3% of their income away to outside causes. So if you're given 1 to 3%, man, you are no different than the average American. You're no different. And so it's going to require more than that. And so it's kind of, I like to think of it this way. If you want something without doing the work, again, if you want to experience the early church, you have to live and follow Jesus like they did. That's it. It's like this. I had a roommate in college who didn't really go on very many dates. And one time we were having a conversation in our apartment. And he was talking about how he hadn't gone on dates in a while. And I was like, so we're talking about this. And he's like, yeah, well, he's like, here's what I want to have happen. I want to like be driving, and he named like one of the roads like on our campus, and like my window's down, and there's a girl walking on the sidewalk, and like we like make eye contact, and like, she's into me, I'm into her, and she just kind of like gets in the car. And I was like, well, bud, that's called kidnapping, number one. And number two, that's not how it works. You have to ask a girl out. You got to be willing for her to say no. You got to pursue her. You got to go on dates. Like, it doesn't just kind of like fall in your lap. You meet someone on the sidewalk and you get married the next day. It does take some work. And so here's where it's interesting. I would say this, right? Within New City Church, where I lead, the churches that you might be a part of, wherever you're listening to this from, and churches all over the world, here's the reality. You can have 2 different types of people right in the same church. 2 different experiences by 2 different people that go to the very same church. One person can experience it like Acts chapter 2, and the other person doesn't. One person does. It's in part of their life. They're generous. They're praying together. There's community. And one person doesn't. And it all has to do with the fact that the person A, let's say, is intentional with their spiritual practice and being a part of the community, and person B is not. The same church could be experienced by, like an Acts 2 church, by one person and not the other person, simply by how they engage with the local community. Now, again, there are I'm speaking generalities here. There are exceptions. I get that. But generally saying, here's the principle. Here's the principle, that New Testament churches are not hard to find. They are really not. They're really not. And I just want to say this too. Well, the churches in my area, they all got issues. If you read the New Testament, they had tons of issues. Tons of issues. They had racism issues. They had sexuality issues. They had greed issues. I mean, reading all these letters in the New Testament to these first century churches, man, they had issues. They had issues. But they're not hard to find if you're willing to commit. And so again, I just want to say this as well. A New Testament church, by the way, is not something you find, all that to say. It is something you do. A New Testament church, it is not something you find. It is something you do. If you want to experience a New Testament church, it is up to you, because New Testament churches are not hard to find. Now we will move into our cultural observation. Typically, what I've been doing is kind of reading, sharing with you some articles that I've read and some reflections. This one is actually just a quote that I read. I want to share a reflection on it. So this was a recent comment made by actress Dakota Johnson. She is, I guess she's been in a lot of movies. She is the lead actress in the movie 50 Shades of Grey. 50 Shades of Grey, which, by the way, I have not seen, which is based off of the graphic novel 50 Shades of Grey. There's been a lot of things. I think that's when she really became, famous in Hollywood, is when she did that movie a couple years ago. I want to say as a side note before I get into this comment, just like men and women should not watch porn, women and men should not read graphic novels. They are totally against the sexual ethic that Jesus gives us on the Sermon on the Mount. They are not helpful. They are not good. So just like porn is bad, and I know we like to get on guys for that, and increasingly women that too, but we get on guys for that, as we should. Like, we should be honest. Graphic novels are sinful. They are not good. They are not your spouse, and you shouldn't read them. So that's not the point of this. I just want to say that. Now, part of the reason behind the morality of it, like porn, graphic novels, that sort of thing, is that one of our justifications to do things, especially things that like are behind closed doors, which is a lot of how the sexuality stuff gets communicated. Like, why do you care about what I do in private? It's this idea that what I decide to do, and it could be a sexual thing or it could be otherwise, but a lot of these like personal, private, quote unquote decisions we make, we'll say things like, well, it harms no one else, or I'm only doing it in private. And then therefore the claim is we shouldn't care what people do behind closed doors or by themselves, because it's in private. Now I'll get more on that on an issue. So I'll talk about more of that in a second, because it has a little bit to do with this quote. But during an interview on June 4th with the Los Angeles Times, Johnson sparked speculation. This is according to the article, sparked speculation that she and Martin, which was her longtime boyfriend, who was the Coldplay. I don't have his first name written down. He's the Coldplay singer, part of the band Coldplay. Or Chris Martin. There we go. They had been together for 8 years. So finally, she had broken off her relationship for good from 8-ish years with Coldplay singer Chris Martin. So it says this. During an interview, June 4th, Los Angeles Times, Johnson sparked speculation that she and Martin had called it quits as she shared her view on relationships. And here's what she said. For a long time, we have been so quick to judge relationships or how they should happen, how they should exist in the world, when people should get married. Divorce is bad. And she says this, the kind of a comment like, is a judgment that people should get married, divorce is bad. And she says this, all these things, actually, if you think about it, why is divorce bad? In other words, why do we judge relationships and why is divorce bad? Now, again, I just want to specifically focus on that sentence. All these things, actually, if you think about it, why is divorce bad? Again, if you're talking about someone who's married, a relationship ends. So she's like, hey, boyfriend, girlfriend relationship ends, marriage's relationship ends. Like, what's the big difference? Why is it bad? And so I just want to say this. Here's why it's bad. The reason it's bad is because all of the objective data says that it's bad. This is not a personal preference or a personal opinion. It is an objective truth that divorce is actually bad. Divorce is really bad for kids. I mentioned, I think, a little bit before on this podcast, the Brad Wilcox Get Married. Highly recommend. It has no anecdotes. It is all real data about divorce, marriage, and kids, and how it all works, and why actually you should get married and have kids if you're able. Also, as a side note, I want to say he's a really good follow on X, formerly known as Twitter. So if you're on X, Twitter, Brad Wilcox, he's got tons of, he's just like really interesting data on marriage, relationships in America, that sort of thing. So one of the things that divorce does is it actually increases mortality rates in kids. It's bad for their physical health, and actually increases their chances of dying and I don't know again how they all track this data, but it actually increases mortality rates in kids, not just like when they get older, but like as kids themselves. It's traumatic for kids. Studies show that divorce in some ways can actually be more difficult than the death of a parent. Now, that's a little bit different, obviously, but in some particular ways that they track, divorce actually works, because when you lose a parent, which by the way I did when I was 19 years old, there's a finality to it. When a parent gets divorced, it can bring distrust it makes kids distrust authority and people that they're supposed to be able to trust in their life, because like, well, if they couldn't work it out, then like, should I trust anybody? It makes it ambiguous for kids on how to relate to each parent, especially if they are feuding. But even if they're pretty amicable, it gets attention for the kids. And it can teach kids to pull out when life gets hard. If something gets hard, and especially in how we often frame divorce today, I just want to do what makes me happy, and we say that to our kids. It shows them, hey, you do whatever you want to do that makes you happy. Now, again, the caveat here, there are legitimate reasons for divorce. So I should have said that up front. Again, this is generally speaking. There are legitimate reasons for divorce. I'm just generally speaking, okay? So it's really bad for kids. Again, kids can be resilient, and grace of God can renew and bring life to even dead situations. But like the data is clear. Like if you have kids in your life, it is really, really bad for them. Not just like kind of bad for them. Obviously, when you get divorced, it is worse on you financially. On both parties, even more so for women, it's terrible for you financially. It's terrible for you terrible for you emotionally. Like the stuff they actually track, people can say, "Hey, I'm doing fine," but it's like, no, man, it's actually really bad for you. The emotional turmoil. It can bring a loss of purpose and meaning to your life. And people that get divorced don't live as long. On average, they do not live as long. Marriage, and also, can I just say, can build character and virtue over the long haul when you stick it out. Obviously, if there's places like abuse and abandonment, that is different. But generally speaking, if you stick it out, and you have a lot of divorces today that are just simply irreconcilable differences, and so you lose the ability to grow as a virtuous person and a person to build character. And so I just want to say, like, by every objective metric, the reason why is divorce bad, as Dakota Johnson asked, is because it's bad. And I think on a rational level, we can probably understand it as well. Like we can understand, okay, financially, emotionally, but like the data actually makes it worse. It's kind of like this. If you don't really have a budget or you don't really track what you spend, you always spend like, you kind of know, hey, I try to stay within my means and I try to spend this much money, blah, blah, blah. But then when you actually start tracking what you spend, it's like way worse than you actually realized. Like it's way more out of control, and you actually have way more control over your money than you realize if you'd ever track it. It's kind of like this when you look at the statistics for divorce. So I mean, like even take about the morality side out of it. Data speaking, like it's bad. And I also want to say this too. I think part of what she was getting at is like, this is just an individual decision between two people. And just like porn or graphic novels or whatever, it's an individual decision between one person. Why does everybody else care? Well, the reason why this matters is because individual decisions matter because society matters. And porn use, graphic novels, divorce, individuals, whatever, because it changes, it changes everything. There's no such thing as a decision that only affects you. So, for example, just because we talked about it, given I guess her role in these movies, like porn and graphic novels, they are not just individual because again, real data. It changes your brain how you view and interact with the opposite sex. When you watch porn, men, it changes how you view and interact with women, and vice versa. When you read graphic novels, women, it changes how you view and interact with men, and vice versa. It changes it. Like on a brainwaves level. And honestly, for just being honest, if you've struggled with that or have had seasons in your life where you were involved in some of these things, you also know from like your experience that has changed it. So there's no like individual decision. Everything you do behind closed doors in private affects how you relate to other people. Also, strong marriages and families make stronger and healthier societies. So there's less crime, especially not just the married couple, but for their kids, for parents that stay divorced. There's more financial prosperity, not just for the couple that's married, but also for their children. There's more meaning and there's better continuity. So there's a lot of great things that happen in society when you have strong marriages between a man and a woman with children. Now, again, this is not to shame or to give guilt to anybody. The grace of God is sufficient for all these things, but we do need to be honest about like the practical implications of our individual decisions. Listen, no decision you will ever make will only just affect you. No decision you will ever make will only just affect you. So, all that to say, Dakota Johnson is asking, I'm not trying to like slam Dakota Johnson. This is just a thought I had when I was reading this article. Dakota Johnson is asking, but also her asking is really a suggestion. It's not really an ask, it's like a suggestion that divorce is not a bad thing, right? She's like, why is it a bad thing? And the only reason that she can say that is because she is ignorant of divorce. Now, and what it does. And I don't mean that pejoratively, like I'm not trying to slam her or shame her. I just mean that in the literal sense of the word ignorant. She just doesn't know. She just doesn't know. And I think our society at large, at least in America where I live, we have a lot of like, who do you care what I do? So there was, Glenn Greenwald, I think is his name. This is probably about a month ago by the time this episode airs. He is I guess a conservative journalist. I don't know much about him, but there was this video released where he's gay and he was sleeping with a prostitute. I guess he used to be married to a man. His former husband has passed away. He had a prostitute, and this was all recorded and it was leaked of him doing like really perverse, gross things. And there was this thing of like, well, this is all separate. Who cares what he does in his private life as long as he does a good job, professionally. And I just want to say, like, you cannot separate these things. You cannot separate like perverse, gross sexual acts with the person. And again, I'm not trying to slam him. But I'm just saying, like, all of our decisions matter. This is why courage matters, character matters, and virtue matters. You can't separate the individual from the person. And so all that to say, listen, what you do in private absolutely affects who you are and what you do in public. Listen, divorce is not a good thing. and there also are no individual decisions. Again, the great thing about following Jesus is that there is grace. His grace is sufficient. We are not our past, that he wipes his slate clean, and he gives us hope, mercy, and love, which is amazing. But we still got to deal with the reality of our decisions, and there is no such thing as an individual decision. And so, yes, also Dakota Johnson, divorce is not a good thing. Moving to our last section, book review. I'm going to do a 2-for-1 today because they kind of go together. The first one is A House for My Name, which is a survey of the Old Testament by Peter J. Leithart. And so you can Google it, A House for My Name, a survey of the Old Testament. And the next one is called The Four, also written by Peter J. Leithart. And it's in the same vein, and it has to do with the Gospels. So I'm going to give you kind of a book review of both and just some thoughts, some takeaways. Okay, so House for My Name, again, Old Testament survey. Here's what this book was about. It was an intriguing and helpful survey of the Old Testament, how all the various stories in the Old Testament fit together and how they ultimately point to and are fulfilled in Jesus. So Jesus is like the stories of the gospel in the New Testament. It's him fulfilling these stories that we read about in the Old Testament. I will say to track with this book, you do need to have some familiarity with the Old Testament. The author even says this. If you've never read the Old Testament, you're going to be like, what's going on? So you have to have some familiarity. And even me, who has a lot of familiarity, at least compared to the average person, because I'm a pastor and I study it all the time, there were still a couple of times I was a little confused, but other than that, I was still tracking with it. The book does an excellent job of pointing out how the various stories we read in the Old Testament are intentional, not just in their message, but also in the form and structure of how they were written. I think people understand like their message is trying to cut across something, but like you have these chiasms, you have these words, you have this grammar, like even how it is written is structured in very unique ways. One of the things I think the author does a really great job about is showing how the typical Sunday school reading of the Bible stories in the Old Testament are often merely moralizations of the characters in the stories. And when you do that, you miss the point. And so when you have all these individual stories, and he's not against like talking about David and Goliath as an individual story, but oftentimes in that story, we just talk about the morality of David and Goliath. And when you just like try to make it here's the morality here, you got to miss the point because the story is not just about that story. There's more things that are going on, and if we kind of make it too simplistic, we can miss that. Also, a lot of the stories in the Bible, there is like moral ambiguity. Like there's a lot of times where the biblical authors don't actually say, is this a good or bad thing? And so you're left wondering. And so again, there's a bigger picture going on. The book was rather dry at times, which was what was hard about it. The general flow was kind of like, this happened, and it was written in this way, and it shows this and points to that. And then this happened, and here's how this story was written, and it shows this, and it points to that. And that was kind of, I'm generalizing here, kind of repeated throughout. That's kind of how it read. Where am I? Yes. I'm not sure how the book like this could be more engaging, though, because it is what it is, but it definitely took effort to stay focused while reading at points. So I will say that. Overall, if you want a better understanding of the Old Testament and how it works together, this is actually a really, really great choice. Just know that because it's rather dry at times, it may take some work to finish. My overall rating was a 7 out of 10. Again, my scores, 8 to 10. It's all based on how much I enjoyed the book. So obviously it's not even necessarily how much you would enjoy the book. It's not even a critical reading of the book. It's just my enjoyment. So 8 to 10 means I enjoyed it and I would recommend it, just generally speaking, to anybody. The reason I give it a 7 is because it was really dry and hard to read at times, or not hard, but just kind of boring. However, I will say, like, if you stick with it and you want to know more about the Bible, it is an excellent resource. And so I would recommend that. So that was A House for My Name, A House for My Name by Peter J. Leithart. And then he has the book called The Four. So I'll give this overview of the four and then some thoughts of all these books together. The Four was a look at the four biblical gospels, the themes and threads in each book, and how they demonstrate that Jesus is as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. I will say, like, if you do read both, I read the Old Testament one first because it does actually help the four as well. This book follows the same style as The House of My Name, which trace the major themes of the Old Testament books and the stories, and now he does the same thing with the Gospels. The first section of the book, maybe the first 70, 80 pages, was actually my favorite. It was about the time between the writing of Malachi, which was the last book that was written in the Old Testament, at least chronologically written, which is about 425-ish years before the time period of Jesus. So you got like 425-ish years between the last book that was written and Jesus on the scene. And he does a great job of showing what was going on there, because understanding Israel's historical developments during this time really helps shed lights on what's going on and happening in the Gospels. It really helps you understand better, like the Sadducees and the Pharisees. To me, that was my favorite part of the book, especially because I read a lot, and I obviously study the Bible a lot. And so some of this stuff was newer to me, which was really helpful. So I really appreciate that, because he spends a lot of time in those 400-ish years, and it's really, really helpful. It's helpful to have some familiarity with the Gospels when you read this book, but it is not as confusing as the house for my name would be if you were unfamiliar with the Old Testament. So the 4 is a little bit easier to track with if you haven't read much of the Bible, because it just is. Maybe there's less stories there. Maybe the stories of Jesus are just more well known, and it's obviously shorter than the Old Testament. So for that, what it's worth. At times, the book can be a little dry and information heavy, so just like A House for My Name. However, I think the average Christian would really be encouraged and even blown away by just how much is going on in the Gospels if they haven't read much about how they were composed before. It might not be the easiest read, not because it's hard to understand, but because it has an academic feel and how it's written. But if you can get through that, you'll be glad you read it. I gave this one a 7.5 out of 10. And again, this is just my rating. I think because some of the stuff isn't new to me, I do think the average Christian would be blown away doing a little bit of study of how connected the Bible is, how the scriptures are a unified story that lead to Jesus, how brilliant not just the Old Testament writers are, but even the gospel writers are. They're intentionally drawing out themes and stories from the Old Testament and Jesus' stories. And so it's just like, I'm kind of maybe used to that. If you're new to that, I think you'd be really blown away and really encouraged that, like, man, the New Testament is like really reliable. I mean, it's just crazy. So I would say that. I think you really enjoy it. So couple of reflections. Peter J. Leithart is the author. By the way, he's also a great follower on X/Twitter, because he's often giving these quick little quips of how the Old Testament, New Testament work together. So again, if you're on social media, follow Brad Wilcox, follow Peter Leithart, and also give me a follow, Dylan J. Dodson. Do that as well. So I just want to say that the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. The last chapter of the book of House for My Name shows how John in particular, how John in particular, the last chapter of the 4 shows how John in particular, the Gospel of John, he said he could, no, I'll scratch that. I got this confused. The last chapter of the book, In a House for My Name, what I originally said, talks a little bit about the Gospel of John. He said he could do all the books, but it's an Old Testament book, not a New Testament book, and how the Gospel of John is tracing various Old Testament themes. So he gives you a little New Testament nugget as well. The Bible is a profound book. Here's what you'll walk away from reading these books: the grammar, the syntax, the ways in which the stories are written, how connecting it all is. To be quite honest, it's really hard for me to comprehend, like how these people did it. I mean, just the genius. And yeah, the Holy Spirit, that sort of thing too. But especially if you take, God's providence out of it, it's like, man, I don't know how you come up with this stuff. I mean, it's wild how just deep and interconnected all of it is. So for example, in the House for My Name, he talks about the creation story. Again, if you're unfamiliar with this stuff, it's easy to miss. How the creation story is seen over and over and over again in all these stories. How the Exodus story is seen over and over and over again in all these stories. And so you have all these parallels between the Exodus story and like all these stories that come after it. If you're a pastor, or you just want to dive deeper and understand the Bible, these books are great. The 4 is very similar. Scripture is a unified story that leads to Jesus. I always like to say this, and the 4 does a really good job pointing this out, that the New Testament is very black and white without the Old Testament. In other words, you can still read and get the gist of the New Testament. You can follow Jesus, become saved, go from death to life to enter into the kingdom of God without the Old Testament or understanding the Old Testament, absolutely. But you miss so much. The Old Testament is what gives the New Testament life and color, which reading these books would really help you do. And so overall, the books take a little bit of work to get through. They're are a little bit dry at times, but they are really good if you do get through them. They are both helpful. And so I might start with the 4, and then if you wanted that one first, if you're only going to do one, or if you're interested, just do the 4. If you're going to do both, I would start with A House for My Name, but you could read any one of those. So thanks for joining me today on The Intentional Life. Wherever you listen to this, just in case you don't know, you can also watch us on YouTube. I'm on social media, Instagram, Twitter. It's kind of where I hang out. And man, thanks for being part of the show. Again, it's a newer show, so I appreciate it if you kind of subscribe, maybe tell some other people about it. And I'll be back with you next week for another episode of The Intentional Life.